It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the MSI MPG 321URX. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. This monitor uses a 32-inch, technically 31.5-inch QD-OLED panel from Samsung Display, and this is driven at up to 240 Hz. It has a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution, and this gives you a really nice amount of desktop real estate. I like to use this without any scaling, so I get a lot of text on the screen at once, but that text is rather small. It might be too small for some people. I think for most people actually it'll be a little bit on the small side. I kind of got used to it. I'm used to using high pixel density monitors without scaling, but if you do happen to use scaling, then you're still going to benefit from that high pixel density, and there's going to be a nice crisp look to text, as long as elements scale cleanly, and in most cases on Windows they do. It also gives a nice crisp look to suitably high resolution image content, and also 4K UHD movies, and indeed games running at that resolution. And there's an article on the website called the 4K UHD 3840 by 2160 experience, which explores this in more detail on the desktop, for video content and for games. It's written from the perspective of a 28-inch screen, but a lot of it still applies here in this case. Although the pixel density is not quite as tight, it's still pretty tight, and it really does give a crisp and detailed look, which isn't achieved on models with a significantly lower pixel density, including 27-inch QHD models. We're now going to take a look at the refresh rate supported and some associated features. So the monitor will run at 3840 by 2160 at up to 240 Hz via DisplayPort, and you can see the refresh rate supported with that configuration here. It supports up to 10 bits per channel. You can also use VRR at the same time if you wish, and also HDR, high dynamic range. Using HDMI, exactly the same refresh rates supported, and again it's at up to 10 bits per channel. Something to note here is that there isn't a 24 Hz mode. I know some people like 24 Hz modes when they're watching certain video content, or if you're connecting a Blu-ray player or that kind of device, which might work well at that refresh rate. That contrasts with the Dell Alienware AW3225QF, which did include a 24 Hz mode. That might be of interest to some people. It's something that MSI could potentially add with firmware in the future, but they might not, because it's really quite a niche thing. Another thing is the Alienware supports a 12-bit signal using HDMI, and that's useful for Dolby Vision, which the Alienware supports, but this MSI doesn't. And you may have a very specific workflow where you can actually work with 12-bit content, but for the vast majority of content, it's going to be 10-bit for HDR or 8-bit, occasionally 10-bit for SDR. And the MSI does fully support these signals. And for those interested, it is a full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 port, so 48 gigabits per second is supported. And you can also have HDR and VRR at the same time as running the monitor at its full refresh rate and resolution. And these are the additional refresh rates supported with the MSI. Using HDMI, these aren't listed via DisplayPort, but as you can see again, there isn't a 24 Hz option here. The lowest is 29 Hz. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about the scaling performance of the monitor. So the monitor does have a scaling and interpolation process, which will map the source resolution to all of its 3840 by 2160 pixels. It's running its native resolution at the moment, so it's not using interpolation, but it supports interpolation at up to 240 Hz at resolutions such as 2560 by 1440 QHD or 1440p, and 1920 by 1080, 1080p or Full HD. So I've just switched over to the QHD resolution. Can confirm the monitor does say 2560 by 1440, 240 Hz, so it's using scaling itself. And this gives moderate softening. It's not actually as soft as I've seen on some 4K models running this resolution, but the softening is a little bit more than I'd like, and you can offset that by increasing sharpness. So there are two sharpness controls on this model. The one I prefer to use is called sharpness, and that's in image. And it's really personal preferences as to how much you might want to adjust this by, or even if you do in the first place. I find one quite well balanced actually at the QHD resolution, but I've just increased it to 2. I think 2 is probably my preference overall. I'd probably pick 1.5 if such a setting exists, but it doesn't. But I'm probably being a little bit picky here. I think 2 is pretty good actually. And if you do find it a little bit over sharpened, then 1's a good fallback. But overall, I'd say this is a pretty decent experience. You can certainly use QHD on this model, just might want to increase the sharpness as I have here, just a little bit. The other sharpness control, so I've just set sharpness to 0, so it's back to default. That's found in Professional and it's called Image Enhancement. If you set this to weak, which is just one up from off, then it has a pretty strong over-sharpening. I don't like it, I think it looks artificial and weird. But if you do like it, then feel free to use it. You can have an even stronger effect if you like. And by this point it looks really, really odd, extremely over-sharpened. I've switched the game over to 1920 by 1080, 1080p, Full HD at 240 Hz. The monitor's using its scaling process. I've set all the sharpness to default, so no additional sharpness is applied, and it really does have a rather soft look, significantly softer than you see on a native 32-inch Full HD model. I know it's not an incredible pixel density anyway, but I certainly think that it's beneficial applying a sharpness filter in addition. So I'm not going to show you all of this. I appreciate you can't actually see on the video what you'd see by eye when I'm showing you all of this anyway, so it's really just what I'm talking you through. But I feel my preference again would be to have sharpness set to 2. Maybe 3 if you don't mind a bit of over sharpening. I don't personally find it quite as well balanced as the QHD resolution, because things do look just a little bit over sharpened in places and not quite sharp enough in other places. This is using my preferred setting of 2, with 3 really looks a bit over sharpened for my liking. But it's still usable, I'd say. And really overall, I'd say the interpolation on this monitor, the scaling process, is actually quite good. There are also some scaling settings in image screen size. So auto is the default, and that's what I've been showing you, just a sort of typical screen filling interpolation process. But you can also enforce a 4:3, 16:9, 16:10 or 1:1 aspect ratio, so 1:1 being 1:1 pixel mapping. Remember, I'm running in Full HD at the moment. So that's 4:3, you can see the black borders at the sides. 16:9, which for this resolution will be the same as auto. 16:10, which basically kind of zooms in a bit, chops off some of the image. And there's 1:1, the pixel mapping feature. And what that does is goes onto my desktop and really annoys me. I was actually going to take that out of the video, but I decided to keep it in just to make you aware that some of these scaling settings, when you use them, it will actually go back to the desktop, so you can't always just seamlessly switch between them and stay in the game. I did actually have to Alt-Enter to full screen the game again. And you can see it isn't 1:1, even though I selected 1:1, so I'll try again. It just went back to auto for some reason, I don't know why, but here it is, it's now working 1:1. So you can see a big black border around the image. Switching over to the QHD resolution to show you that it still works, but it has a smaller black border. So now it's only using 2560 by 1440 pixels on the monitor, and the remaining pixels just become that black border. From the front, the monitor has pretty smart home office styling. The bottom bezel there, that is metal. Whereas the stand, that is entirely plastic, at least on the outside. It is weighted, so it has a decent sort of weighty feel to it. But I personally prefer a bit of coated metal on the stand as well, especially on premium monitors. But the overall construction of the monitor's pretty decent, really. It doesn't feel cheap or anything like that. You've got pretty good ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit. You can swivel it left and right. You can adjust the height by 110 millimeters, 4.33 inches. And there's also slant adjustment. You can have it like that in either direction. I'm not entirely sure why you'd want to do that. You can't rotate it into portrait though. Even if the screen was at its highest stand height, you wouldn't be able to do that because there wouldn't be enough clearance on the desk anyway. And that's what the screen looks like at the highest stand height and lowest stand height. So the stand base is reasonably compact for a large screen like this, so you can put it reasonably close to the wall. The depth of the stand base is around 9.5 inches or 240 millimeters. As usual for QD-OLED, it has a dual stage bezel design. So there's a black panel border surrounding the image, and then there's a hard plastic outer component. There's also an active area, so an over-provisioning of pixels, which is used as one of the image retention mitigation measures on the monitor, as usual for a QD-OLED. And that sits between the actual image and the panel border. Also of note from the front is the screen surface. That is glossy. It has a highly effective anti-reflective treatment, so it doesn't give you obvious mirror-like reflections in most lighting. But you do have to be aware, as typical for QD-OLED, that there are raised blacks or dark shades as the room becomes brighter. So the lighting at the moment's pretty well controlled. It's not super dim, but it's moderately dim. But as I brighten things up, I let some natural light stream in and some of it striking the screen surface directly. You can see a bit of a colourful tint, and you can see that the blacks are raised if you compare the black of the panel border to the rest of the screen. This is typical QD-OLED behaviour. I'll explore the advantages and disadvantages of the screen surface a little bit more in the contrast section. I think it's worth taking a quick look at the screen from the side just to show you how slim it is at thinnest point, although it does bulk out centrally where the stand attaches and where a lot of the electronics and other gubbins of the monitor are housed. At the rear, black plastics with various textures. So you've got some glossy plastic there, for example, a little bit of glossy elsewhere, some sort of brushed textured matte and some normal plain textured matte, and a little glossy plastic MSI emblem there. The MSI Dragon. At the top here, these aren't speaker grills. Monitor does not have integrated speakers, but it is passively cooled. It has a graphene film used for cooling, so it doesn't have active cooling. It doesn't have a cooling fan. So if you want to avoid monitors with fans, that should come as welcome news to you. There are some lighting features to be aware of, although they're not particularly impressive. They just face the wall for most people, and you won't actually be able to appreciate them from the front. This here is the height of excitement, which you'll achieve with the MSI lighting feature. It's just doing its little rainbow cycle, which is the default in the OSD. That's the only lighting feature on this monitor, unless you count the power LED as a lighting feature, but you can't customize that. You can customize this using MSI's software if you wish, but it isn't a useful lighting feature from the front, as I mentioned before. You can only see it from the back. There's a K slot towards the bottom right. These are the OSD controls and the power button. And as for the ports, they face downwards. You've got a 3.5mm headphone jack, you've got two HDMI 2.1 ports, DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, the USB-C port with 90 watts of power delivery, DisplayPort alt mode and upstream data. You've then got a USB Type-B upstream port, so the monitor does have KVM functionality as it's got two upstream ports. That allows you to quickly switch the display input and also reassign USB peripherals connected to the monitor between two different systems. And there are two USB 2.0 downstream ports. And finally, but very importantly of course, there is the power input. That's an AC power input, so the monitor has an internal power converter, rather than relying on an external power brick. I'm now going to explore the subpixels of the monitor. So this monitor has what I call a 3rd gen high DPI QD-OLED panel. It's 32-ish inches, 3840 by 2160. That's shown in the bottom image there. It shows the subpixels, whereas the top two images, they show the 1st gen QD-OLED panel. That's used on the 34-inch 3440 by 1440 models. And to the right of that is a 2nd gen QD-OLED. So that's seen on the 49-inch 5120 by 1440 models. As it happens, it's also seen on some of the new 2560 by 1440 OLEDs with 360 Hz refresh rates. So the subpixels always have this kind of triangle RGB layout, sort of triad design, whatever you want to call it. There's a green subpixel which is displaced above the red and blue, rather than sort of neat little red, green and blue subpixels right next to each other in a very uniform fashion. There are some fringing issues to be aware of, and they're explored in an article which I've linked to in the description of the video. I'd highly recommend reading that article. It goes into some detail, it shows some visual examples. But what I can't do with these visual examples, I can't actually show you how the fringing looks when you compare the different generations, 1st versus 2nd versus 3rd gen high DPI. I can only talk you through it. I can say that the 2nd gen did make some nice improvements over the 1st gen. It sort of squared the subpixels out a bit, and the effect of that was that any fringing you saw, the fringing was basically just thinner and therefore less noticeable. And when you add to that a higher pixel density, a significantly higher pixel density, the fringing becomes really thin and very difficult to see actually. Even if you're quite sensitive to it, and you might have found it bothersome with the older generations, you should really find the new generation very good in this respect. So as I said, I can't show you examples and show you what it would look like by eye. It's either going to look extremely exaggerated on the video, or you're just not going to be able to see it at all. And actually, to be honest, the not seeing it at all is probably closer to the actual experience you'll have when you're using the monitor, at least in terms of the fringing. Hopefully you will actually see the monitor. But some of the examples I gave in the article anyway, where it was particularly noticeable, potentially noticeable, really high contrast situations. So you've got this table of contents here. You've got white text, pure black background, and then a white background around that. And you can see the fringing, various different colours, except the fringing is so thin in this case that from a normal viewing position, it's really not something that should catch your eye at all, even in cases like this, which are really sort of torture or extreme examples where the fringing could be most noticeable. And for the text, I don't find it problematic. If you invert that so it's white text against black background, just like shown on the table, again, I don't really think the fringing is going to be an issue for the vast majority of people. And the taskbar as well, as a dark taskbar against a light background. And the fringing here I found quite noticeable on the 34-inch models, the first generation. On the second gen, it is thinner, but I did kind of notice it a bit. And on this one, it just doesn't draw my eye. I mean, I can see it if I specifically look out for it, and I'm looking quite closely at the monitor, but it doesn't bother me, it doesn't catch my eye, and this is really how I think most people are going to find this monitor. Very similar to an IPS LCD in terms of how text and other fine elements are represented. I'll now look at the calibration of the monitor. So this table here has various different conditions that the monitor was tested in, and it has gamma and white point readings taken using a Datacolor SpiderX Elite colorimeter. So straight from the box, pretty decent setup really, 2.2 central average gamma. I will look at the gamma in a little bit more detail shortly, and a 650K white point, so a little bit cooler than my preferred 6500K target, but not massively so. And this was consistent with various Pro Mode settings which emulate different color spaces. So you've got sRGB, Adobe RGB, and Display P3. Only thing I noticed really which was a little bit different was, well, there are some slight differences with the gamma, and I will again come on to that, mainly with the sRGB setting. And I say slight, they're not massive differences, but I'll still cover them. But really it was the green push with the Adobe RGB setting, which I did note in the table. So the green channel was quite neutral with all of these settings, except with the Adobe RGB, it was a bit on the strong side. So you could say a slight imbalance there, but actually it wasn't really a strong green push in terms of the channel imbalance. So it might not be something you'll necessarily pick up on or find annoying anyway. And really the Adobe RGB settings pretty niche on the monitor. As usual, if you're going to be wanting to use the monitor for color accurate work, I would generally recommend calibration with your own colorimeter or similar device, and you can use the full native gamut and map things properly from there using color aware applications. But if you do want a sort of set and forget setting, these color space emulation settings do work nicely. Also tested low blue light. I like to test that kind of setting just to give an indication of what it does to the white point, and that's how it really does its thing in most cases with these low blue light settings. It sets it to a much warmer white point, 5205K, and that is an effective low blue light setting. Gives a bit of a green push to things, which is why I also like to test the warm color temperature setting. And that was quite similar in terms of its white point, but the color channel balance was different. So green was lower and red was raised a little bit, but it's certainly still an effective low blue light setting if you like to use that kind of thing in the evening, for example, for a more relaxing viewing experience, or any other time if you're a bit sensitive to blue light. And then set color temperature to customization with everything set to 100. For some reason, at least using the default firmware, my unit had everything set to 50 by default. But anyway, if you want to use customization, set everything to 100, and that should look more similar to normal. With everything set to 50 for the channels, things should look quite dim and a bit odd. With the test settings, I got 6479K for the white point, which is close enough to my 6500K target. And under the table there, you can see how I actually set things up for my test settings, and these are explored in more detail in the best settings video. And there's also just a little note at the bottom there. It says that ICC profiles aren't used in the review, but there are some in the description of the video if you wish to use them. You might want to use gamut mapping and other aspects of the ICC profiles. So I've got one using my test settings and another using Pro Mode sRGB with everything set to the default in that setting. But of course, if you want to be changing the brightness according to your own preferences, don't be afraid to do that. So this graph shows the gamma under my test settings compared to the 2.2 target curve, and it's pretty good actually, good gamma tracking, slight deviations, nothing that's really worth exploring in more detail here. With the sRGB setting, the tracking wasn't quite as good. The main thing you might notice by eye, it's not exactly a huge issue, but the gamma's a little bit low for dark shades. It's not so obvious on this graph just because of the precision or resolution of the graph, but I did analyze this in other ways as well, and I could see that the gamma was certainly a bit on the low side for darker shades, and that lifts some darker shades up so they're brighter than intended, and that can give a little bit of unintended detail or a bit of a less masked or less blended appearance to some darker shades. But it wasn't an extreme shift in this respect. and it really was somewhere between the sRGB gamma curve, which gives a more significant uplift here, and the 2.2 gamma curve, which is really pretty well blended here. So actually the kind of look that this gives, I think many people will quite like, because it doesn't give a strong uplift, just gives a little bit of an uplift. And some people might feel it quite suits the strong contrast of the OLED, because you still get nice distinctions as well. And certainly black or the very dark shades can still be deep and very inky looking. These graphs here show the gamma with my test settings again, just for reference, and compares that to the test settings, but with brightness reduced to 10 and then to 0. So the monitor does have some gamma issues with very low brightness levels. Most people aren't going to use such a low brightness, but you can see that if you're using a brightness of 10, or by a brightness of 10 I should say, things have become a bit wonky, and it averages 2.1 for the gamma. By 0, there is further deviation from the intended 2.2 target, and the average gamma is now recorded as 2.0. So it's not necessarily going to be a problem. You're just using the monitor for general purpose use and you want to be using a very low brightness level. Don't be too afraid of this. I just wanted to mention this for completeness. And to round off, just taking a quick look at sRGB color accuracy, as I like to do, using an sRGB emulation setting. In this case, the Pro mode equals sRGB setting of the monitor. Good performance overall here. Average delta E 1.22. As usual, the pesky 1F cerulean shade is the highest. 5.82 in this case, delta E 5.82. It's pretty much always the highest shade error. It's just that slight changes in blue versus green for this shade can really throw things off here. OLEDs tend to be a little bit weaker at this than LCDs, so there tends to be a bit of a higher error, but it's always moderately high, and it's pretty much always the highest error of this test. I can't recall it ever not being. And remember what I said about gamma as well, being a little bit off for some dark shades, so you can see that perhaps affecting shade 6E, which is a very dark grey. The error there, 2.58, certainly not atrocious, just a little bit higher than most other shades. Moving on now to the contrast and brightness performance. The black luminance and contrast ratio, well, as usual for an OLED, in this test the black luminance is recorded as 0, there's no backlight, and the black pixels are entirely off, and the contrast ratio is therefore recorded as infinity to 1. So you don't have to worry about those columns, but white luminance is certainly very relevant. And by the way, the black and white luminance values for these tables, they're recorded using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus, which is now marketed as a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus. You'll see that there's a range of values for each reading in the table or each condition in the table. The reason for that is that the monitor does employ slight ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior, but I stress the slight here. It means that the monitor does dim slightly depending on the content being displayed, and in this test the white patch is displayed with a background surrounding it, a desktop background. Various different backgrounds are tested, a lot of different backgrounds, lots of different mixtures of shades, including pure white and pure black, but basically a lot in between that. A lot of the time though, the monitor will stick to near the highest reading reported for each condition. So the maximum recorded, for example, here was 2432254, and that's with color temperature set to customization at 100% brightness. So that's the neutral position with all the channels at their neutral 100. So this is actually less of an ABL behavior than I saw under SDR on the Dell Alienware AW3225QF, which sometimes had a range of sort of 50 or so nits when you talk about 100% brightness using the full native gamut and all of that. So yes, the maximum for this MSI it's close to. And the minimum, that was 29 to 34 nits, which is nice and dim, and even pretty sensitive users should find that quite good. And some of the Pro modes did give slightly more ABL behavior. It's not really something I would have been able to tell you was happening by eye in an obvious way at all, even when I was on the desktop and moving things around, shifting things, massive changes in the image. It's not obvious ABL even with these Pro mode settings, so it's not something I'd worry about. And with my test settings with this colorimeter, I recorded 163 to 170 nits, and again with it spending most of its time at the upper end of the range. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance using some in-game examples. As usual for an OLED, you've got per pixel illumination, so exceptional precision here. It means you can have some pixels shut off to display black, or nearly shut off to display very dark shades, right next to pixels which are much brighter. And there's no glow of any type to worry about, no IPS glow or even VA glow, and the gamma consistency is exceptional throughout the entire screen. So that means the detail levels for dark scenes, for example, they're maintained exceptionally well throughout the entire screen, right to the very corners of the screen. So when you're observing the monitor in a dark room like this, you get lovely depth and atmosphere, really nice inky look to the darker shades, no impediment at all from any backlight. An appropriate brightness can be given for the brighter shades, but also the medium shades. And actually a lot of the medium dark shades have nicer depth to them. It just really gives a more solid look than you'd see on LCDs. Again, it's not something you can appreciate in the video properly, but certainly by eye, it is something which I've noticed testing various OLEDs. Certainly a look that I appreciate. I've now brightened the room up significantly. Most of the time when I'm using this monitor, it won't be this bright. It's not super bright though. I mean, I'm not in an uncontrolled lighting environment. It's just that there's quite a bit of daylight coming into the room, but it's not striking the screen surface directly, which is why you can still appreciate quite a bit of the detail, and it doesn't really have the kind of obvious, uplifted, very colourful look that I was showing you earlier in the features and aesthetics section. But you can still see some reflections because it's pretty bright, and there is a bit of a lightening up of the screen surface. It might not be so obvious on the video, but the black of the panel border versus the rest of it. Although I would also stress that this game under SDR doesn't actually use pure black for the very dark shades, so there's a little bit of an uplift anyway. It's not exactly the best scene for showing you that, but I just wanted to show you that, you know, if there's a bit of brightness in the room, don't worry too much, you can still get a really nice experience. But I'm just going to introduce more lighting. Now it's what I would call uncontrolled lighting. There's a lot of light streaming in from the right side now as well. You can actually see my door there, nice reflection there, and again you can see sort of the colourful elements on the screen surface. And it's these kind of conditions which you really don't want to be using this monitor in if you can avoid it. So there's a significant lightening up of the darker shades now. It really does spoil the OLED quality, and really you're going to get a better experience probably with a matte LCD or indeed a matte OLED in these conditions. So to really appreciate the OLED advantages in terms of contrast, you don't want to be sitting in a very bright room like this. But it doesn't have to be pitch black either. So the glossy screen surface definitely brings with it some advantages. There's just more direct emission of light from the screen surface. There isn't layering or graininess at all in front of the image. Really nice smooth representation even when you're looking at very bright shades. It kind of has a bit of a painted on quality, as I sometimes like to refer to it. And also with a bit of ambient light in the room, as I do have now, yes, you can get reflections at times, but actually when you're looking at the image, as in first hand using the monitor, you don't tend to focus on those. I mean, it's quite a subjective thing, I guess, but I don't find them distracting unless the room's very bright, like I was showing you just before. And with matte screen surfaces, the ambient light is diffused across the screen, which floods the image, and that's not a nice thing to have either. So it's sort of a trade-off, the matte versus glossy thing, and it's a very personal thing, but I do actually like this kind of screen surface myself, but as I've demonstrated, I can control my lighting environment quite tightly. That's not always the case for other people. I'm now on legom.nl, the website, in the test for viewing angles. So I'm going to explore colour performance, and I like to talk a little bit about colour consistency first off. The Legom text test looks very consistent indeed on this monitor. So there's slight red striping to the text, but it's consistent throughout the screen. There aren't changes between green, orange and red at different points of the screen, or flashes between them as you move your head. So a really nice consistent performance here, which indicates an extremely low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. Same when you're looking at solid colours, they look extremely consistent, at least they do to the eye. I know on the video it looks like there's this weird little pink blob in the centre of the screen, but actually to the eye this is a very consistent pinkish purple throughout the screen. The red block appears a very consistent rich red throughout the screen. Green block, a nice consistent green chartreuse throughout the screen. Very, very slightly brighter looking towards the edges of the screen, but that's not anything to do with viewing angles or consistency. It's just the dual stage panel border puts a little bit of pressure there, so it just lightens up certain shades like this just a tiny bit. And I do stress a tiny bit. The blue block, that appears nice consistent royal blue throughout the screen. I also observed various dark grey shades, including 5% grey and various others, just to look for something called DSE, dirty screen effect. This is something which I notice on VA panels quite commonly, and some OLED monitors have issues with this as well. Usually WOLEDs, but occasionally QD-OLEDs with different panels. But as with the Alienware version that uses the same panel as this one, I didn't have any issues with DSE. Really very, very minor striations in some places for very specific shades, but nothing which caught the eye at all, nothing obvious, nothing which I could even show you in a realistic or representative way in the video, which is why I'm not bothering. It really has very strong consistency, and DSE just isn't an issue with this model. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction using some in-game examples. For most SDR content which you consume on the monitor, so if you're browsing the internet, watching video content or playing games like I am now under SDR, then the developers or creators of the content will usually have sRGB in mind, as it's the standard colour space used. If you're using a gamut on the monitor which extends beyond that, then you invite extra vibrancy and extra saturation. The colour gamut of this monitor, just putting that up on the screen, I measured 99% DCI-P3 coverage, and for those interested, 93% Adobe RGB. Just be aware that the exact figures here depend on the software used and the device used to measure. But that means there's a lot of extension beyond sRGB, and you can see that here. So yeah, generous gamut, very wide gamut, strong vibrancy, and bear in mind as well the exceptional consistency which I've mentioned with Lagom and also earlier with respect to Gamma, with it being an OLED, so that vibrancy is really every pixel of the screen if it needs to be. So it gives the sky blues here, for example, extra pop, kind of a bit of a cartoonish look, you might say. Skin tones can look overdone, too reddish because of the generous gamut as well, and earthy browns or sandy colours like this. There can be an orange to red quality, so things can look a bit less neutral than they should. And it can affect the greens as well. For example, the bushes here, they look a little bit brighter than they should, although these particular shades shown here, they're quite dusty looking shades and they don't look too eye-catching in this case. And also the green of my weapon, that has some extra vibrancy to it. Looks a bit less muted than it should. But, you know, some people are going to really like this look, the nice vibrancy. It's kind of what they expect. It's what they want from their experience, and that's fine. But if that isn't you and you want a more toned down look, closer to the developer's sRGB intentions, then you could use the sRGB emulation setting. Pro mode sRGB. And with this, you can adjust the brightness. So I've got that set to 50 at the moment, which is pretty close to what I had with my test settings, just for comparison. You can't adjust the colour temperature, so you can't adjust the colour channels, and you can't adjust contrast. But it certainly does its thing to cut the gamut down, so just showing you that on the screen here. You can see it's now covering 97% sRGB, so there's a little bit of under coverage, but not much, and no over coverage to speak of. So yes, this is an effective sRGB emulation setting, and as I explored earlier, it is quite an accurate one as well. And the sky, for example, is toned down. You can see that visually. Looks more muted, more appropriate really. And there isn't the kind of orangey, reddish push to the earthy browns. The bushes are also a bit dustier looking, a bit more toned down, a bit more appropriate really. Although, as I said before, they weren't too bad, these particular shades. And the weapon as well, it's more subdued. And sort of just the paints in the background there, and the solar panels as well. The solar panels had more of an obvious blue tint to them before. If you find you want somewhere between these two sort of extremes, if you like, then you could use one of the other emulation settings. So Pro Mode Adobe RGB. Remember that Adobe RGB coincides with sRGB for the red and blue corners of the gamut, but for the green corner of the gamut it extends massively beyond sRGB. And what that means in practice is that cyans, they have a lot of pop to them. So the sky, again, it's looking sort of more cartoonish and vibrant. You know, some people might like this look. It also means that oranges are brought out strongly, not pure reds, but oranges. And that can again give earthy browns a less neutral look, orangey look in this case. Green shades as well, because of the gamut, they can be brought out rather strongly. It's not too bad for these particular shades, but some other examples and other scenes, they can have quite a almost sort of slightly neon look actually in places. So it just depends what kind of look you want. Just have a play, see what you like. Again, the same restrictions apply as they did with the sRGB settings. You can't adjust the colour channels or the contrast, but you can adjust the brightness. There's no gamma control on this monitor, by the way. Better move back before I get shot. And just switch over to the DCI setting and talk a little bit about that one. So display P3 as it's called on the monitor. The gamut with this one, it now covers 96% of the DCI-P3 colour space, so that's down from 99% recorded using the full native gamut, but still decent DCI-P3 coverage, and it gets rid of the over-coverage beyond DCI which you wouldn't want, so mainly for the green to blue edge of the gamut. So really this gives a more toned down version of the native appearance, but it still maintains oversaturation, so the sky is kind of somewhere between sRGB and what it was natively or with the Adobe RGB settings, so it's toned down a bit but not to the extent of sRGB. It does tone down the sort of reddish quality you can see to earthy browns, and you could to skin tones as well. It does a bit, but it certainly does maintain some extra saturation there still. And it certainly will tone down your green shades. Again, not the best example of that in this particular scene. They look quite a nice actually golden green shade now. Has actually toned them down a little bit. I'd say they look quite appropriate here. So you might like this representation. So it's just a nice flexibility to have. I'm just going to switch back over to my test settings now. Of course, if you're using the monitor for color critical work, it can be nice to have these different emulation settings. So you can just quickly switch between different color spaces on the monitor. But ideally for color critical work, you really want to be calibrating using your own colorimeter if it's particularly important, color accuracy to you. That will make various corrections, not just of the color space, will allow gamut mapping using the full gamut, which will give you the maximum coverage possible on the monitor, but also make various tweaks to gamma and other aspects of color balance, and it will just tighten things up. So that's really ideal, but it's still nice to see these different color space emulation modes on the monitor as a set of easily accessible settings. The other thing to remember with this being an OLED is that if you're viewing it off angle, then it has exceptional viewing angle performance. So that's really tied to the exceptional consistency I was talking about before. It's just really exceptional viewing angle performance. So if you've got some mates around and they're looking at their screen at the same time as you from the side, if you happen to be sitting a bit below the screen or standing up above it, it basically looks like a picture, really consistent. And actually any shifts you see on the video, they're actually from the camera rather than the monitor. Focusing in now on the HDR performance, I'm just going to jump straight into the figures because this is an OLED, not an LCD, so you don't have to consider the black depth or contrast readings. The same applies here as it did under SDR in that respect. So here you can see the monitor using its peak 1000 nits setting with the purple line, using its true black 400 setting with the grey line, and the orange line shows the Dell Alienware AW3225QF for comparison. So this test here, if you're not familiar, it has different white patch sizes, or some reviewers would call this window sizes, 1%, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% and 100%. So you've got a white patch covering that many pixels surrounded by pure black with the remaining pixels. So in the case of 100% white, there are no black pixels, it's a complete white screen fill, and that is a sustained reading, whereas the rest are peak reading. So with a sustained reading, this was taken 30 seconds after the shade was first displayed. So you can see things are really very similar to the AW3225QF, which uses the same panel. It's slightly curved, but it's the same panel. And this is really a very typical QD-OLED behavior. They're pretty consistent actually in this respect. So really for smaller details, so 1% window, it can achieve just above 1000 nits. And it then dims as more bright content is displayed on the screen. So for 4% white, it dims down to 886 nits. For 9%, it's down to 507 nits, so around half of its maximum luminance capability. But really, as bright shades start to become far more prominent, so 25% and above, you're looking at 365 nits or below. The true black 400 setting is more consistent, so that peaks at 465 nits, so significantly below the peak using the peak 1000 nits setting. And the minimum recorded is 257 nits using that setting, so actually marginally higher than the peak 1000 nits setting, which had a minimum of 250 nits recorded, but this is a very slight difference. And the main thing you will notice is that 257 and 465 are not as far apart as 250 and 1010. So that's what I mean by more consistent. Now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running the game under HDR, the monitor's running in HDR with its peak 1000 or peak 1000 nit setting. This is my preferred setting on the monitor, but again, some people may prefer the more consistent performance of the HDR 400 setting if they don't really want the high brightness, but they want less of a difference between the maximum and minimum brightness levels. So even in this scene here, I can see some definite OLED advantages. So there's a mixture of medium, and dark shades here, as well as some slightly brighter shades if you're looking up there. But the per pixel illumination allows it to deliver excellent depth to the little rock cracks and the shadow details, and I mean excellent depth. The medium shades are given nice depth as well, even if there are brighter shades right next to them, or medium bright shades. So it's just that level of precision which you don't get on LCDs, even ones I've used with mini LED backlight solutions. They just don't have this level of precision. This is like having millions of dimming zones. And there's definite contrast with the bright area here. Nice natural bright look to the daylight there. It's just sort of passively streaming in. The monitor's not trying to show its maximum luminance there, and the game isn't demanding that it does. So it's showing this nicely. Another advantage under HDR is the monitor can use 10-bit color reproduction, and indeed that's the pipeline used for HDR10, which is the format that this monitor and most others respond to. This allows for what I like to call a greater nuanced shade variety. So there's a greater variety of very closely matching shades. It really just gives a nice natural uplift to the detail levels. I didn't really talk about black crush on this monitor because it's not really a thing. It tracks the 2.2 gamma curve quite well, and actually, if anything, some details are lifted up slightly more than they should be. That's under SDR, by the way. People don't always understand, but the 2.2 gamma curve is supposed to look quite masked for darker shades. But anyway, moving on to HDR, with the 10-bit color reproduction and the nice tone mapping used here, it really brings out these darker shades in a nice way, a nice natural way, because there's still plenty of very dark and slightly dark looking shades, really looking as I'd expect them to look here. Diving into the water now and considering some brighter shades or brighter to mixed content. The weather effects there, the mist over the water shows some nice smooth gradients, much smoother than you'd see under SDR. Again, the 10-bit color reproduction coming into play here. It also allows the monitor to use its wide gamut appropriately. I'll come on to that a little bit later. But this scene here, really nice contrast between the brightness there, the darkness there, the medium shades, basically everything in between the very bright and very dark shades. And the ball of light, sorry, not the ball of light, the reflection of the sun on the water surface, that looks nice and bright, really nice and eye-catching. I measured 966 nits here, although it depends how big that ball of light is. So sometimes it will go down to 640 nits or so. It's because of ABL behavior. Most of the time it's actually closer to the 966 nits. The AW3225QF, my unit at least, was slightly brighter than this. So instead of 966 nits, it went up to 1010 here. And the minimum I recorded was 720 rather than 640. So not a dramatic difference, maybe just some differences with the PQ curve or how they're calibrated really. And this is just a specific example. There might be other scenes where the MSI is slightly brighter than the Alienware. It can go either way. So as I mentioned, there are two different HDR modes on this monitor, and this is covered in the best settings video. Just be aware that you want to have your game mode set to user for the optimal experience. If you set other presets, then they can filter things in weird ways and mess the image up in various different ways, including sharpness filters, oversaturation, that kind of thing. But really, user is the intended look here. Just quickly visiting some other scenes on the game. This is the one I showed you in the contrast section under SDR. The depth of the very dark shades is improved under HDR. It's just how the game decides things should be mapped. And the precision under HDR, the tone mapping precision, can really help bring out these tiny little details, which I'm afraid you can't see in the video, but they're just little, very subtle skull details. But the depth of the very dark shades there is exceptional, but there's still actually a variety if you look closely, or if you look closely in person, you can see this, of very dark to exceptionally dark shades, and then some very slightly lighter or medium dark shades for the little details. So things are brought out in a nice natural way. This is the kind of thing which mini LED models will often struggle with, because there's just a greater level of precision required than they can provide with the number of dimming zones that they will have. And you don't have to worry about blooming either, as this is an OLED model, so it can show very bright shades like around Laura's bow there, and even just if you look at the crosshair with darker shades surrounding it, there isn't any kind of blooming. There's just an immediate transition between the very bright and very dark pixels. Another scene where this blooming can be an issue on mini LED solutions, but that OLED's precision really comes into play, is this scene here, or scenes like this. So there's some little candle flames, and on the video I know it looks like there's an obvious bloomy halo around them, but there isn't actually to the eye. It really just looks sort of natural and as I'd expect in this scene. With mini LED solutions, they aren't able to have such an immediate transition between the very bright shades and very dark shades. And actually often the little bright elements like these candle flames will be dimmer on the mini LED solutions because it's going to have to dark bias a bit because of the medium shades surrounding it or medium dark shades surrounding it, and that can drag things down. So it's not just halos you have to concern yourself with there. And even if you're looking in the background there with the little lights on the rope there and also up there, there can be some troublesome transitions on mini LED solutions. If you move around and sort of change between the sky or the wall in the background and the lights, the transitions there can make the zones go a little bit crazy, the dimming zones, and it can actually cause a bit of a flickering effect. There's nothing like that to concern yourself with here. Now this scene, it might not be the most exciting scene, but it is one which I find OLEDs particularly good at representing. I should say it's represented particularly well on OLEDs, and actually QD-OLEDs in particular. So there's this nice, you can't really see it in the video, this looks like a kind of ball of white, but the glint on the water surface here actually has this really nice bright silvery purple outline, and WOLEDs aren't able to produce this properly because they have a lower color volume. They have an unfiltered white subpixel, which means they're unable to show high brightness and strong saturation at the same time. I'm not saying this is the most strongly saturated element, so actually some elements would show this in an even more obvious way, but even little things like this on WOLEDs, it just doesn't look right. It looks like there's a weird posterization effect going on because it doesn't have a bright silvery purple rim, it just has a bright core, which is kind of a pure white or a cool off-white, and it just abruptly transitions to a much dimmer sort of purple ring around the object. Whereas here it's much more nicely blended because it's able to have both the saturation and brightness at the same time. So I'm not going to bang on too much about this. I know I've mentioned it in various other reviews, and it's really more relevant when I'm actually reviewing a WOLED monitor, and I definitely will mention it there. But it's just something to be aware of, that WOLEDs aren't really quite as good, in my opinion, as QD-OLEDs when it comes to HDR performance, and bright saturated objects at least. And the rest of this scene is also shown really nicely, so there's a really nice mixture of dark to medium dark shades and some medium to bright shades, all shown very nicely. Again, mini LED solutions will often have to compromise here because of their lack of precision. So the OLED here is able to show exceptional depth to the little dark cracks there, little dark shadow details. And again, there's a nice range, a nice nuanced shade variety here as well. It's not just one single dark shade. And it's able to show the somewhat brighter and the medium shades appropriately next to those dark shades. Of course, I don't want this to be all one-sided praise because that would be unfair. So I'm now on a scene which can help explore the ABL automatic brightness limiter behavior in a more specific way. So this scene, as it's displayed at the moment, there has a lot of bright shade because there's the sun in the background and lots of bright sky there. And that's filling up enough of the image where the ABL is kicking in, the automatic brightness limiter. So if you think about the graph I showed you earlier, this is where the shades will dip significantly below the peak of the monitor. So that sun there is not as bright as it could be at all. And just the sky around it isn't as bright as it could be. If I shift things a bit so there's less of that displayed, then the ABL goes down a bit and some of the bright sky just around the map there at the moment becomes actually a bit brighter. The effects of the ABL don't just affect these bright shades though. If you look at the HUD elements, you might notice a shift there as well. And it's not just the camera causing this shift, it's actually observed by eye when I'm looking at the monitor as well. So the elements are much brighter here, the HUD elements, than they are here. And actually I can notice the shades in the background, those medium shades shifting as well, becoming brighter and dimmer. Again, that's not just the camera going weird, that is actually something that I can observe by eye. I actually spent a while in this game getting to this particular position to really show a very clear example of this. So it's not generally as obvious as this, but just to point out there are some scenes that can certainly cause the ABL to kick in rather noticeably, where bright shades start to dominate. I've switched over to the True Black 400 setting and I've recalibrated the game with the in-game slider just to make sure that the peak brightness is appropriately reduced now as well, according to the capabilities of the monitor, and just to show you that things are more consistent now. And I have to apologise actually, just the way that the game shows things, those medium shades, they do actually shift even here, and it's not because of a brightness shift, it's just if your character's looking at different things in the game, it sort of has this filter that changes that. So that was exaggerated because of how the game's showing it. But the HUD elements, they weren't exaggerated because they're sort of medium bright shades, and the ABL does have a noticeable effect on those. And the bright sky as well, there's not such a shift even between there and there, as I saw to my eye, at least using the peak 1000 setting. So things in general are more consistent. So some people might prefer this, but personally I like the strong brightness peaks, which the monitor can make good use of in many scenes. You don't think I'd leave out Battlefield 5, do you? So this mountain scene here, it's a bit of a torture test for OLEDs. There's a lot of brighter shade here. It's not completely, full screen white or anything, but really is a bright dominant scene. And here, OLED models like this, the ABL kicks in pretty heavily, and the representation of this scene overall is just not as impressive as it is on some mini LED solutions. So the sun there, most of the time in this scene, it would be around 350 nits, but it can be a bit higher than that or a little bit lower, depending on the exact makeup of the scene. But on mini LED models, the sun there can be really strikingly bright, not around 350 nits bright. And the glint of light on the water surface there even can be certainly brighter than it appears here, and even the sky in general, the brightness is just limited by the ABL behaviour of the OLED. That's not to say the scene looks terrible and dim, but if you've got the comparison in mind, or you've actually experienced a mini LED solution on scenes like this, you might notice a difference. Back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider on another scene now, I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction. So just to give you a quick reminder of the gamut of this model, 99% DCI-P3 coverage here, and some extension beyond DCI in some regions. So under HDR, unlike under SDR, developers and content creators can happily target much wider gamuts such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020, a very wide gamut that this monitor does not fully cover. It's somewhere around 80% Rec 2020 coverage on this model, and that's actually pretty high for a monitor. Most of them don't even come that high. So what that means is the monitor is able to make better use of its generous gamut. And unlike under SDR, you don't get the kind of oversaturation that I mentioned. So Laura's skin, for example, it's toned down significantly. It's more natural, more as it should appear. Whereas under SDR, the reds are brought out too strongly, so she looks a little bit too tanned, to put it politely, using the native gamut of the monitor. And some of the greenish shades had too much pop to them as well. They looked a bit garish actually under SDR, and that's toned down under HDR. The monitor does actually use a little bit of what I'd call artistic license. So if I compare to my AW3225QF, the Alienware shows them in a slightly more muted but actually more accurate way, whereas on the MSI there's a little bit of extra pop, but not as much as under SDR. And actually I think the balance that MSI achieved here is one that people are going to really like, because it doesn't look sort of unrealistic and obvious or cartoonish oversaturation. It's just that it does add a little bit extra. The sky, for example, that looked really quite cartoonish, I'd say, under SDR, whereas under HDR it is suitably toned down, but it still looks kind of vibrant and vivid beyond what you'd see with the sRGB colour space in mind. And certainly there are nice vibrant elements where developers want them to be. Some HDR content can make better use of this than others. It really depends if the developers are really going for those Rec 2020 colours, or at least trying to push the DCI-P3 gamut heavily. It's up to the developer, but on this title certainly there's kind of a mixture and some very nice vibrant shades where they're supposed to be. So the flowers here, for example, some blues that are much more vibrant than you'd see with the sRGB colour space in mind. So they stand out nicely, but they're supposed to be there so it doesn't look weird and out of place. The dresses on these characters there as well, a nice variety of orangey browns, whereas their skin doesn't look overdone or anything like that. And the little citrus fruits here, I'm afraid I cannot capture these on the video properly at all, but to the eye they almost look like tennis balls. They're not supposed to look just like lemons, it's supposed to be a sort of more luminous greeny yellow than that, and it certainly achieves that on this monitor. They look like they might be slightly overdone on this monitor, but I know that this particular shade is supposed to have rather eye-catching pop. So overall, definitely a nice monitor to use under HDR. I actually spend a lot of time using HDR on this monitor. As with other OLEDs, not perfect in terms of its bright scene dominant brightness capabilities. But certainly where there are smaller bright areas, it can show really nice brightness, and its contrast capabilities and indeed colour capabilities shine through in a nice way under HDR as well. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 240Hz refresh rate. I've got the game running at 240 frames a second, or 239 frames a second it seems, some weird rounding going on. Anyway, let's just say 240 frames a second, so making the most out of the monitor in that respect. So this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination brings with it a few key advantages. So compared to a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60 frames a second, or 60Hz, the screen is pumping out up to 4 times as much visual information every second. This improves the connected feel, and that describes the precision and the fluidity as you interact with your character. This is also aided by low input lag. This monitor has exceptionally low input lag. I measured 0.74 milliseconds, so really an exceptionally low signal delay, which you don't have to worry about. The other aspect of the high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it greatly decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement, and that's the dominant form of perceived blur you will see on monitors. There's an article on the website looking at monitor responsiveness which explores the concept of perceived blur in more detail. It also looks at a photography method called pursuit photography, and that allows you to capture not just the perceived blur due to eye movement but also the pixel response element, which is the other aspect which is very important when it comes to monitor responsiveness and what you'll perceive on the monitor. So here are some pursuit photographs running at various different refresh rates. There aren't any overdrive settings to worry about on this monitor because it's an OLED, and you'll see the effect of the refresh rate on the perceived blur due to eye movement, which is reflected by improved internal detailing really on the UFO and just the general object appearing sharper and more clearly focused. There's also a reference screen which is the RCA Evolution Premium, and that's a fast LCD running at 240Hz. You'll see that the OLED still has an edge in terms of its overall clarity when you're looking at the object itself. So with the OLED you can actually count the little white notches on the UFO, and just the details are more sharply focused. And that's because of its exceptional pixel responsiveness. That also affects any trailing behind the UFO, and the Evolution Premium doesn't have a lot of that. A little bit of powdery trailing you can see for the top row with the Evolution Premium, and also a little bit of overshoots, a little bit of halo trailing that's actually a bit brighter than the background for the medium and lighter background, so the middle and bottom rows. But the OLED, it doesn't have any perceived overshoot you need to worry about, or any weaknesses due to slower than optimal pixel responses, even for the demanding 240Hz refresh rate. So I know some of you prefer figures, so here are some figures. These are taken with the OSRTT Pro tool. This is the same tool and also the same methodology used by TFT Central, although they sometimes do things slightly differently with OLED monitors. Now the reason I'm mentioning this is because, well, different reviewers will use different methodologies, so be careful when you're cross-comparing the response time readings of different reviews. But also the reason that TFT Central doesn't like to use things as they are here, you can actually see, is that some of these readings are outliers. They're sort of phantom readings, if you like. The reason for that is that the tool is very sensitive to the brightness regulation used by OLEDs, so they use what's called high frequency, low amplitude oscillation, very different to PWM, pulse width modulation. It doesn't cause the same kind of flickering effect, so that's why most people will find OLEDs perfectly comfortable, even if they find LCD monitors with PWM a bit uncomfortable. But technically the backlight isn't completely stable, as there are some very slight cyclical dips in brightness. And anyway, the tool is sensitive to these and it can throw off some of the readings, particularly when it's going to 0 as its endpoint, black. So that's why you can see 2.7 milliseconds and 2.6 milliseconds on the table for some of these readings. But anyway, these initial response time readings, the average initial response time is 0.91 milliseconds, which is excellent and OLED-like. And again, you might see that slightly golden green colour for 7 and get a little bit concerned that this monitor, oh, maybe it has an overshoot problem. It really doesn't. There's no perceived overshoot. This is really what I would consider a phantom reading, again, just because of the sensitivity of the tool I use to the brightness regulation method of the monitor. And these results are at 120 Hz, the others were at 240 Hz, sorry if I didn't mention that. Really, there's more of the same. Some of the phantom readings here are lower, so 1.8 milliseconds maximum, but really that's going to be sub 1 millisecond in practice. Anyway, regardless of that, average initial time 0.84 milliseconds, very much OLED territory here, and nothing to worry about in terms of perceived overshoot either. 60 Hz, well, very interesting things here. Again, the tool going a little bit crazy with some of these readings. Some of them are exactly 0, which causes the average complete time to be recorded as minus 12.07 milliseconds. Very strange, but the average initial time was recorded, and that's really what I'm showing you in the table here, the initial response time. So the average of that, 0.4 milliseconds. But again, don't worry too much about the exact figures, just pay attention to the fact there's a lot of green here, and also the actual perceived experience is exceptional. So yeah, speaking of that perceived experience, LCDs will typically have some weaknesses in places, 240Hz LCDs. It might be just for some transitions, like white against the medium background there. They might show some weaknesses from slightly slower than optimal pixel responses, or with the little shadow details with the medium to brighter shades surrounding. There might be some weaknesses there. But there's absolutely nothing here to do with pixel responses, just a perfect sample and hold 240Hz experience, visually flawless in that respect. Another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one just shows different transitions being performed. There are lots of darker shades and some high contrast transitions with darker shades against much brighter backgrounds. VA LCDs will typically struggle a lot here. IPS models sometimes will be struggling a little bit. Even TN models can struggle with some of these transitions. No such issues at all here, not even isolated weaknesses. No issues with overshoot, no issues with slower than optimal pixel responses. So I'm just going to move straight on to talking about VRR, variable refresh rate. This monitor supports VRR, and you can use that with Nvidia G-Sync compatible, or you can use AMD FreeSync. I'm using an RTX 3090 at the moment. You can use HDR at the same time as VRR if you wish. You can also use HDMI 2.1 VRR, so that means you can use Nvidia G-Sync compatible via HDMI 2.1. You can also use AMD FreeSync via HDMI, by the way, but HDMI 2.1 support also means you can use it on the PS5, which doesn't support adaptive sync, but will still be able to leverage HDMI 2.1 VRR. So the claimed range of operation on this one is 48 to 240 Hz. In my testing, as usual with my RTX 3090, a little bit off that, but not massively actually. I found that generally the floor of operation seemed to be a little bit above 50 Hz, maybe as high as 53 Hz, possibly a little bit above that. This isn't really something you have to worry about unless you're running at a very specific frame rate on the game and you want to try and avoid this LFC, low frame rate compensation boundary. When you cross LFC, low frame rate compensation boundary, there is a momentary stuttering. It's a bit more noticeable on OLEDs just because the pixel responses are so fast that there really isn't any extra kind of mask of perceived blur from that to help mask any of the stuttering. And that's another reason why some people might really like to use VRR on OLEDs in general, because it gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches and does that very effectively. So I'm running the game at 120 frames a second, the monitor's running at 120 Hz now. And yes, there's a drop-off in connected feel and an increase in perceived blur, but that's because of the drop in frame rate. It's not something that VRR can fix, but there isn't tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. Down to 60 Hz now. Again, a real drop-off in connected feel doesn't feel very nice at all compared to those triple-digit frame rates, but this is just the frame rate, it's not the fault of the monitor itself. And again, an increase in perceived blur, but no weaknesses from the pixel responses of the monitor, really just a flawless sample and hold 60 Hz performance now. No issues with overshoot, as I will often comment on with LCDs, with VRR in particular, at 60 frames a second. Something you do have to be aware of though is VRR flickering. And this is an issue which affects OLEDs like this, and that is because there are some slight changes in gamma, which can be perceived for dark shades in a variable refresh rate environment as the refresh rate fluctuates, especially with quite violent or significant fluctuations. So at the moment, the game is sort of hovering around 200 frames a second, but it sometimes goes up to sort of close to 220, sometimes actually as low as 175. And I can observe some slight flickering in places, but it isn't so obvious that I can really show you on the video, and it's not super eye-catching here because there aren't mega fluctuations occurring. But if you want mega fluctuations, I've got you covered. You'll see with the reported refresh rate of the monitor, it's going all over the place now. And I can observe this VRR flickering. And you can see the flickering, actually on the video it looks like it's sort of in places where you can't really see it to the eye. So the cutoff point that you'll sort of see it visually, it's really for these darker shades near where my mouse is now, and a little bit for the medium dark shades actually as well, but really for the darker end of the gradient basically. On VA models you'll see it throughout the gradient, sometimes you'll see it sort of for every shade, whereas on OLEDs it tends to be for the darker shades where you can see it. And just as a general point, I'd say the VRR flickering on this model isn't as bad as I've seen on some OLEDs. For some reason I tend to find it more noticeable on WOLEDs. This one, I think it's pretty typical for a QD-OLED. It's quite similar to what I saw on my Dell Alienware model, really. You can also see it during loading scenes sometimes, or loading screens. So I can see it here, and that's sort of the occasional supreme flicker, just because of the extreme changes in refresh rate it causes. In-game maps can also show VRR flickering, and in the game itself, it can be difficult to show this in the video, I'm afraid, but to my eye I can just see occasional flickering for the darker shades. And Cyberpunk does tend to show this quite a bit because it has some quite violent fluctuations in frame rate at times. And it doesn't really matter if the frame rate is particularly low or particularly high. It can occur with either, but it just tends to be the greater fluctuations. So certainly if you're passing the LFC boundary, which can actually happen on Cyberpunk, then that will cause a huge change. So to give you a bit of an extreme example, let's say the game was running at 60 frames a second, monitors at 60 Hertz, and then it suddenly drops down to 50 frames a second. The monitor might jump up to 100 Hertz because it's a bit below its usual LFC cutoff point. Anyway, on this model, personally, I don't find the flickering so obnoxious that I would want to disable VRR even when I'm playing games like Cyberpunk. But sensitivity to this flickering varies, and for some people it might be the case that actually disabling VRR is preferable. And it does depend on the games you're playing and your GPU and system in general, what kind of fluctuations are occurring, as to how obnoxious this flickering might or might not be. And just a final point to note, the monitor does not include a pixel strobing or BFI, black frame insertion mode, so it's always going to be a sample and hold display. It doesn't have an extra blur reduction feature if you like, but as I've explored in this review, the sample and hold performance is exceptional, as you'd hope from an OLED. To wrap up then, this monitor really gave an experience which was quite consistent to other QD-OLEDs I've used, but as it uses a high DPI 3rd gen QD-OLED panel, I was happy to see that fringing wasn't really an issue on it. So I quite enjoyed using it for productivity as well as entertainment purposes. A note on productivity though, of course, it is an OLED, so there's always that risk of permanent burn-in. The monitor does have a 3-year warranty which includes burn-in cover, so that should give you a little bit of peace of mind. But if you're wanting to use your monitor heavily for productivity purposes, then my general advice as a reviewer is just to think very carefully about whether you really want an OLED. I personally do use OLEDs myself, and that does include some productivity, but it's not all I do, and I do try to be careful not to leave the monitor on for too long on the desktop or on a static screen like this. Just use Windows Power Management and as many of the integrated OLED care features as you can stomach on the monitor, then that's definitely a good start. In terms of the build quality, well, actually personally for a premium monitor, I would have preferred to have seen some metal on the stand. I like the look and feel of metal on stands. It just gives a nice solid premium feel in my opinion. There was a little bit of metal used on the bottom bezel, but the stand, pretty plasticky, quite nicely weighted at least, so the screen didn't feel light and cheap in that respect. But I do feel that the Alienware model, which also has a plasticky construction, just feels a little bit more premium than this one. The contrast performance as expected for an OLED, per pixel illumination, really nice, very helpful. SDR brightness is going to be good enough for most people. They're going to set their monitor between 100 and 200 nits. Some preferences either side of that, which this monitor also accommodates. Goes up to 250 nits. So some people will prefer obviously a brighter experience than that. That isn't what you can expect from OLED models like this. Although with the exceptional consistency, I'd say the perceived brightness is a little bit better than you'd generally see on LCDs, plus the glossy screen surface can help in that respect. So it might be that you can tolerate a bit of a lower brightness than you would usually like on LCDs. The monitor didn't have any concerning ABL behavior under SDR either. It was actually lower in that respect than the Alienware model. Not that I think the Alienware had a particularly obnoxious ABL under SDR, but even so, the MSI had less of that. With the exceptional consistency and the generous gamut, it certainly provided a highly vibrant looking image. I recorded 99% DCI-P3 and 93% Adobe RGB, so it also lends itself well to colour critical work or colour accurate work within those colour spaces, particularly DCI-P3. Ideally you might have even more Adobe RGB coverage, but it's still a good level of coverage with that colour space in mind. The monitor also had 3 different emulation settings for sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3. They worked well. I would have liked to have seen the colour channels unlocked, but at least you could adjust brightness, and the way they were calibrated was pretty decent as well. And if you want the most out of any monitor, including this one, in terms of colour accuracy, I'd always recommend calibrating with your own colorimeter or similar device. The monitor also provided a nice, generally bright and colourful HDR performance. The usual QD-OLED characteristics applied, so the peak brightness was outputted where smaller bright elements were visible on the screen, whereas when bright shades dominated, ABL, automatic brightness limiter behaviour, kicked in and limited the brightness output. But for many scenes, it really was able to show some nice bursts of brilliance. And the colour volume is also good, being a QD-OLED, meaning the generous gamut can be put to good use under HDR, and it can also have both strong saturation and high brightness at the same time, unlike WOLED models. And really on the colour side, there's little to complain about. A little bit of extra vibrancy to some shades beyond what was intended in some scenes. So really on both the contrast and the colour side of things, very capable under HDR. Responsiveness, well, your typical OLED performance there. And that is to say, no weaknesses in terms of pixel responsiveness or overshoot to worry about. Just a really solid sample and hold 240Hz experience. Very low input lag as well, exceptionally low actually. So I did thoroughly enjoy gaming on this monitor. I enjoyed watching movies on this monitor. I enjoyed just using the desktop on this monitor. I really do feel that this monitor puts the panel to good use, and I think they have priced it very aggressively in some regions such as the US, and it is certainly as such a monitor I can recommend. Having said that, you could consider it a bit of a conditional recommendation because in some regions it is not priced as aggressively as some competing alternatives. So I actually own the Dell Alienware AW3225QF. If someone was to swap the monitors, to take my Alienware away, give me the MSI, I wouldn't be too upset, to be honest. I'd be quite happy with either one. I got the Alienware because it was actually a lot cheaper in my region than the MSI, and also when I got it, the availability was just sort of a bit different, and also I wanted to review it, and it was easier for me to just buy it than try and wait for Dell to give me a sample. I mean, there are of course aesthetic differences to consider. Personally, the curve doesn't really do anything for me, but I don't find it obnoxious either on the Alienware. So that's not really a strong preference for me either way. I don't really mind. I personally slightly prefer the design of the Alienware just because it fits my setup, which is sort of black and white, the theme I've got going on my computer case and peripherals really. Sort of a monochrome theme if you like. But the MSI doesn't have an obnoxious design or anything like that. I kind of like to be able to use Dolby Vision when I'm looking at some movie content as well, which the Alienware provides and the MSI doesn't. But I would not really pay significantly more for one over the other. I'd really look at which monitor is cheaper in your region. There's also a slightly cut down version of the MSI which doesn't include firmware updates. It doesn't have the same USB power delivery or the same USB capabilities. I can't remember off the top of my head. There could be some other slight restrictions on it. Haven't used it myself, but I would expect, because it uses the same panel, that it would offer similar performance to this one overall. It's slightly cheaper. Whether you'd pay extra for knowing that you've got firmware updates or not, that's quite a personal thing. It's just another option to consider if you really want to save a little bit of money, but you still like what you've seen from this review. There's a link to both MSI models in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.